What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are back with a new series for the 2023 offseason. Today, we are starting to dive into the Detroit Lions free agency signings and do some deep dives, do some breakdowns on these players. This is not the breaking news. Instead, this is taking a look at that player, diving into what they've done, who they are, and projecting what their role would be within this Lions defense and what they're going to bring to the table, as well as giving out a final grade on the signing. So let's get it started. Welcome everybody to another video. Glad you guys are here. And yes, we are back, man. More free agency talk. And I love doing these types of videos, man. The breakdowns, the deep dives, diving into the player that the Lions brought in. So no, this is not breaking news, but I know these videos tend to be a little bit longer. I'll do my best to not make it super long, but I do love diving in and breaking down these players. So today, we're going to be talking about the biggest deal in terms of length that the Lions have given out to a player that was not a re-signing to this point and time, and that is cornerback Cameron Sutton from the Pittsburgh Steelers. So in this video, I'm going to start by taking a look at his contract very quickly, just diving into how much he's getting paid. Then we'll talk about the player, what he's done. I'll give you an idea of what I think his role will be for the Lions, and then finally, I'll give you guys a letter grade on how I felt good the signing was based on the contract and what he brings to the table and his projected role, all of those things. So today, yes, we're starting with Cameron Sutton, the cornerback out of Pittsburgh. Important to keep in mind when we go through videos like this, the projection is definitely really early. I mean, we could have more free agency signings, trades, the draft hasn't happened yet, so it's a little bit more loose projecting what someone's role is going to be until you see the entire picture. So I'm basically just doing this based off of what I saw on the guy's film and how I feel like his skills translate, and a little bit of what we already know about what we may have at that positional group. But the importance of that is that you don't usually get a direct line, especially from guys that are coming from other teams, okay? You don't usually get that direct line of like he's going to be the exact same thing we just saw, because a lot of times there's not those connections. A lot of teams have different types of schemes. Now, you may have things that can carry over. For example, in Emmanuel Mosley, I really liked him in man coverage, and I felt like he was one of the better man coverage free agents available. That's why I liked him. Even though they didn't play the same defense in San Fran necessarily that we play, there were skills that I felt like were translatable. That can be the case with all of these guys. Occasionally you'll get one that's a complete straight line. He's coming from a team that the Lions maybe had coaches at, and it's like he's doing the exact same thing here, but a lot of times that's not necessarily the case. So you have to project a little bit, and that's what we're going to be doing here with Cameron Sutton. So the first thing we got to do is take a look at this contract. I won't spend too much time here because we already kind of dove into this when we talked about him signing initially, or when we looked at the salary caps. But as you can see, his cap hit for the season is only $3.28 million. The Lions added 2 void years to his deal to help spread that thing out because there was a $10.9 million signing bonus. So to spread it out amongst 5 years instead of 3, they added 2 void years to that deal. There's not really an out within the first 2 years here for Cameron Sutton. However, there is heading into the 2025 season as his dead cap lowers to $6.54 million. So he seems like he's going to be locked in for the next 2 years. You can see his cap hit jumps to $12.68 million for 2024 and 2025. Again, there's an out after 2024, and again, there's void years on that deal, which will accelerate if he's not extended beyond. Now, let's get into this player and what he's going to bring to the table. I want to start off with some stats first. We'll start there, and then we'll get into some of the film that I've watched a lot of this guy. Let's start with the stats first, okay? Now, these are coming from different sources, so I'll throw those up on the screen. This is a 5'11", 188-pound cornerback that's 28 years old. According to Pro Football Focus, this past season, these are 2022 stats, he allowed 36 receptions on 71 targets and a sub-70 passer rating and only 11.4 yards per reception. And also, according to Pro Football Reference, where he played in 16 games this past season, started in 15. He allowed a sub 50% completion percentage, 5.3 yards per target, 4 touchdowns and 3 picks, and 15 pass breakups, which I think is the key stat there because that ranks 6th in the NFL. Also, next-gen stats, because they all have kind of a little bit different numbers here, had him allowing 32 receptions on 72 targets, which is only 44.4%, which for next-gen stats, it was the 5th lowest for any cornerback with at least 50 targets since 2016. Okay, so basically the point is, while all their numbers are a little bit different, they're all really darn good. Now, Pro Football Focus, as you can see there, I have their grades: man coverage versus zone coverage of 54.7 in man, 66.9 in zone. The important thing there is it's not necessarily position based, that's just man or zone, and there's different types of man, and of course there's different types of zone that you can play. And then at the bottom are his snaps from playing in the slot and lining out wide. Now again, this is kind of to the point that I just brought up where projection is important, because you could say the same thing about a guy like Mike Hughes, for example. When we signed Mike Hughes, he was coming from the Kansas City Chiefs, where he basically never touched the slot cornerback position. He only played 9 snaps in the slot. However, we bring him in, immediately he is our slot corner. He plays 220 snaps in the slot for us. Now, about 6 weeks into the season, that transition, he became more of a wide corner. Then we put Will Harris into kind of being the all-time slot for the remainder of the season. But one thing that's key here about the comparison between him and Mike Hughes definitely more of a projection to the nickel, as you can see by the snaps, but also because outside of that, he didn't really play a lot in the slot, outside of a little bit of a stretch there with the Minnesota Vikings where he did pretty well. For Cameron Sutton, you've gotten a little bit of both, but again, big important difference here is they don't run the same scheme we do. They don't get up and press man as consistently as we did. We were one of the highest man rated teams. We played some of the highest man rate in the league this past season, much higher than the Pittsburgh Steelers. Still, 35% of his snaps came in man coverage, a form of it, less press, more off man. That is different. So again, it's not going to be a straight line projection here. So this is just something that happens, and you try to project based on skill set. So with that, let's dive into some of the film, and I'm going to throw some clips up, but I'm going to talk through a couple of different phases of his game and break it down kind of like we did some of the draft videos, between his press coverage, his off man coverage, and his zone coverage. And I'll try to really separate playing in the nickel versus playing on the outside and what I see there. But let's start with the press coverage first. And this is very important, specifically when lined up at the outside cornerback position within this Lions defense. Now, that's not to say that schematically we couldn't change a little bit, be a little bit more different next year, but when you're playing press man, it's really emphasized for the outside cornerbacks, because you're being asked to be physical with a guy that could be much bigger than you, could be longer than you, could be quicker than you off the line. So it's much more important there than the nickel, where it's a little bit different. Okay, a lot of times you're not right up on the guy. A lot of times the slot receiver is also off the line of scrimmage, so you have some distance between the two. It's almost like a little bit of playing off man in there, and a lot of times nickels play through a lot more help. Especially with the Pittsburgh Steelers, that was the case. When you're on the outside, your help is the sideline, and if you have safety over top. When you're in the nickel, your help can be from the linebacker position. You could be trying to squeeze to one side or the other, but a lot of times you're playing through help because the slot receiver has a two-way go, because they don't have the sideline to worry about. So that's something to keep in mind. But from the press cornerback position, I'm going to dive into things that I like and things that I didn't necessarily like within his game. Not to say that he can't improve on any of these things, but just from what I see. One thing that's important here is the measurables, okay? We talked about him being 5'11", which is not a problem. Emmanuel Mosley's only 5'11", but I think he's more of an outside guy. Now, that's more of a direct translation, because he never touched the slot really at all in this past season with the San Francisco 49ers, but I think his skill set also makes much more sense to stick on the outside, even though they kind of list at the same size. But important traits they have to look at here is that his hands are only 8 1/4 inches, very small hands, and also only 30-inch arms, short arms as well. This wasn't something that he necessarily lived in with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Like we said, more zone coverage, a lot more off coverage, specifically when he was on the outside. However, there are some things that I definitely still like here. First off, the first thing being, again, like I said, he plays off of help. Now, this is a lot of times the Steelers defense, you play through help when you're in the nickel because they have that two-way go. Cameron Sutton, whether he was in the slot or on the outside, I think this is something that he did really well, is understanding where his help was. And we've heard Aaron Glenn emphasize this, but especially when you play a lot of man, it's important to know where your help is. In zone, it's kind of just the nature of playing zone. But when you're in press man, it's very important to know where your help is. And I think he is very good at understanding where his help is. If it's on the outside, understanding where the sideline is, where are the safeties dropping, right? Are the safeties playing the outside so that he's squeezing inside? Are the safeties covering and closing the middle of the field so he can try to force to the outside? Where is his linebacker help? I think he does a fantastic job, and it translates really well into the nickel as well. He utilizes his help really well, cutting off some underneath routes. If he doesn't want you to get inside, he won't let you get inside. Also, on top of that, where are my linebackers? And what ties in really well with all of this from the press is that he's going to give you different looks, not only for the receiver, but also for the quarterback. There's a couple of examples of this where pre-snap you may see one thing, and then right before the snap, he'll adjust his alignment, whether that's moving to outside leverage, inside leverage, playing straight up. he'll adjust his alignment right before the snap, and that can give the quarterback a different look. It can show where the help is a little bit differently. That way he's not giving it away, but he disguises how he's going to play the receiver right before the snap. You're working through the press and into the stem of the route, but still in that kind of alignment. I like his ability to get his eyes back to the football. This is something that is there with Cameron Sutton that the Lions, they still want to improve upon. Every team wants to get better at this, but especially when you play man heavy, it can be very difficult to get your hands on the football consistently. It really can, because a lot of times you're not seeing the quarterback, and man, it's different from off man, it's different from zone, but press man, a lot of times it's difficult to have a lot of plays on the football. But one thing, and this really shows up when he's pushed into the slot, ability to find the ball. This also shows up on the outside as well. A really good feel for as soon as that receiver gets his head around, for keeping connection, staying in phase, but also finding the ball very early in the route. One of my knocks from press is that he can get a little bit overly aggressive. Now, I think some of this is just kind of the nature of his play style. You get some really good reps here as well where he stays patient with his feet, but it's also just kind of the way that they ask him to play the position. But there are definitely reps where he gets very aggressive. He's no longer square. Some of that is just immediate off the snap, which is the kind of defense they're playing to kind of force a certain direction.
Now, one thing that Sutton had, even going back to his time in college at Tennessee, is the quickness in his feet off the line of scrimmage, which allows him to not be forced to cross his feet and get tangled that way. However, he doesn't have great explosiveness through the transition and acceleration, so he will want to get himself declared as early as possible, especially if you put him against twitchier matchups, which can limit how long he can actually stay square with the receiver through the press.
But other times when he's trying to play straight up, he can get a little bit overly aggressive, open his hips a little bit, and they can kind of flip him around. Now, that kind of points to one of his biggest strengths, which we'll get to. However, that is one thing that you do notice. And again, that's not what he was asked to do a ton of with the Steelers. Another thing that pops up here, especially as you're going through the stem and out to the first break of the route, is the long speed. Okay, now he clocked in at a 4.52 40 coming out of the draft with a 1.53 10-yard split. But the long speed, while it's not a big time issue, it's definitely not great long speed, and especially as you see as it gets out there into the third level and the route gets a little bit longer, right? They start to cross the field, the long speed starts to show up a little bit. He can be stacked when he gets to those types of positions. Specifically, usually shows up from the outside, especially when you're in press, because again, as the route kind of develops and gets a little bit longer and you're trying to stick in the hip, the long speed can start to show up a little bit. Now, this is where it's important. I think you need to hit on outside versus inside. When lined on the outside, it is important in certain matchups that he faced. Certain games he played more slot, certain games he played more wide, but matchups were always crucial. Now again, defensive schematics change that. When you play more zone, you can sit more on the outside. When you're playing press man, then you have to get in a situation where you understand what matchups you're getting. You have to be matchup aware. And for him, you can see the difference based on certain matchups and the comfortability. He seems to do much better when he's against less twitchy receivers at the line of scrimmage. The Gabe Davis, which similarly, you look at Mike Hughes, one of his best games on the outside this past year came against the Gabe Davis, right? Even the Jamar Chase, like those type matchups, Amari Cooper, those are the types of matchups where he looks a little bit more comfortable in those spots. Certain matchups, if you're asking him to get up and press on the outside, you're going to have to probably want to stick away from a little bit. And also there is the size element as well. Now, one of my favorite parts about his game, and this shows up specifically at the catch point, I was one of my knocks for Mike Hughes, is being able to be undersized on the outside, but also still kind of set the tone at the catch point, or at the break. A lot of times these guys can get kind of bodied, and there were occasions of that, but he definitely tries to set the tone, I would say, at the break, at the catch point. He tries to really make his presence felt the best that he can. And sometimes you have the interception against Cincy to open up the year where he gets a little grabby, he gets called for a pass interference. He picked it off, but he got called for a PI. But for the most part, he tries to set the tone there. Something to keep in mind is that this is not your 6'2", 205-pound, 4.4 40 kind of guy that any matchup you want to throw at him, you're going to get that versatility. Those guys are hard to find, right? Kind of the Okuda build. He's not that. However, what he is a guy that with certain matchups on the outside, I really feel like, even from press, even though he didn't do it a ton, even from press, I feel like he could absolutely hold his own. I think it's a lot of the similar matchups where Mike Hughes looked at his best on the outside again against a guy like a Gabriel Davis, something along those lines, because he plays with physicality, but at the same time, they're not as twitchy off the line. They don't stack him as easily. They're not just blazing right by him, where that can show up as an issue. The long speed can show up as a problem. Acceleration, deep, again, when you're working over top here, is subpar, average to below average type of range. You just talk about that acceleration when they just kind of open up that second gear and go. There's potential that he's going to get stacked against certain matchups when that is the case. Not to say he's slow. Back to things that I like. One thing I really like is the way that he paces himself. One of the things that you'll come to love, I think, with Cameron Sutton is the body control. I think it's one of his best attributes, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But in press, the way that he's able to pace himself, right? So we talked about maybe getting a little bit over aggressive in the release. However, when you get into the stem, the way that he paces himself in a press situation where you're not looking at the quarterback, right, and you're not backpedaling, you're trying to stick in their hip. In those situations, he does a really good job of pacing himself, not getting too far on top of the route, but also not getting blown by. And again, that's why certain matchups are important for that, because if you get a guy that's way faster than him on the outside, he's going to have to get more aggressive, and then that's when you can run into issues of comeback routes, curl routes, things like that, because he's going to get caught on top. But Steelers did a great job of not putting him in those spots. So when he had matchups that they liked and they put him on the outside, he did a fantastic job of pacing himself. It allowed him to stay connected at the break point, on some of those underneath quick routes, and being a playmaker in those spots. You know, some of those bigger cornerbacks don't always have the foot quickness, a playmaker underneath consistently. I think that's an area where for Sutton, on the outside in a press, that can show up. The thing that I wrote down here is tight ends. So like I said, with the receivers they are matching him with on the outside, there were times where Pittsburgh would get tight end matchups on the outside, so they would put him on those type matchups. Again, he handles those pretty well. Similarly to what I felt about Mike Hughes, he handled tight ends pretty well. And finally, again, my last point here was being aggressive at the catch point, right? Trying to set the tone. It's something that you have to do, especially on the outside, when a lot of times you're going to be undersized. You have to be a guy that's willing to be the aggressor. Now, it's tough because you're going to get some flags, but he wasn't overly, flagged, but you can't allow yourself to just be bullied at the catch point consistently. So matchups are important, I think, when you're asking him to press. Now, moving to off man, this is an area for man coverage where we saw 35% of their snaps were man. This is an area where he played a lot of man coverage, specifically on the outside, but it's also these traits can really translate from the slot, as I said, because usually there's some depth off the snap. 5+ yards that's going to be given between a slot receiver and a slot cornerback. So these traits can really translate to a lot of different spots, but really from an off-man coverage position, which is playing your man but also being able to see the ball. Actually, he does this really well, considering there's a lot of guys that play this role and there's a lot of defense that do this, but you get a guy that leans more one way or the other, where they'll either lean really watching the quarterback and they'll lose routes and lose phase and lose touch with the route, or they'll really not focus too much on the quarterback, they'll focus too much on the receiver, and then they're never a playmaker on the ball. He has a really good balance of being able to see quarterback and man, which makes a great off-man corner, which is not an easy position, an easy role for a cornerback to play. It's very difficult, but his skill set allows him to do so. Now, one of my knocks here is when you see him pedal from an off-coverage position, there is limited depth that he can create. He will quickly try to get into his half turn, can allow him to much more comfortably get depth from an off-coverage position because the pedal is a little bit limited. But if you're not going to attack him with a fast receiver off the line, you're going to really push him upfield. He doesn't have to transition, and he can sit in his pedal a little bit longer, but it's not something that he's going to want to live in, right? And this can show up from the outside, but again, from a slot position, when you see it, is you're going to get less of this because a lot of times slot routes are going to break a lot sooner. They're much more underneath. So for this, you're not going to usually from a slot backpedal very much. A lot of times it's a quick, decisive boom, boom, and I'm gone. It's like a 1-2. Okay, he's going to make his break. So you're getting less of that pedal action from a nickel position than what you would get from the outside receiver position. But one of my favorite parts of his game, and this shows up really everywhere, zone, anywhere, is how he responds to route indicators, right? And this is a lot of times we say route anticipation. This is something that he does really well, right? And this is feeling and having a sense for when a receiver is showing that he's going to break, change directions, reading body movement, reading change of pace. Now, that's not to say it doesn't get him into trouble. Even at college, right? You get aggressive, you'll jump it, and then they can get you on double moves. That kind of thing happens. However, playmaking is going to ask for that, right? So you have to try to really find that balance. And for him, he is really good, even though it wasn't always right. A lot of the time, he does a really good job of reading those route indicators while also not being fooled too often, but being able to then make plays on the football.
Great example here at the top of the screen. Notice how he's seeing the quarterback's eyes, but also his receiver. He senses that receiver start to slow down in his route, and then he anticipates and steps himself in front of this out-breaking route as the quarterback is staring it down. But also notice here how he doesn't just completely shoot forward, one foot in front of the other, and get himself in a really compromisable position to be beat on a double move. Instead, he moves with really nice balance, allowing himself to potentially adjust if necessary. If you're a fan of Devin Witherspoon, you're probably a fan of Cameron Sutton. Very similar type of rep right here. They roll into a cover one. He's going to bail out here at the snap, but he still has this outside receiver. And notice again, as that receiver starts to kind of slow his route, he anticipates, jumps in front of this dig route, and the ball doesn't go there, but he jumps.
Help himself out. One thing here with Cameron Sutton is he's not the most explosive plant and drive cornerback. You're not getting that. You're not getting the most explosive, 10-yard split here where he's going to plant, drive, and he's there. He's not necessarily top echelon there. So for him, anticipation is extremely important because it can get him a tick ahead of where the receiver is going to be. And you saw a lot of jumps because of things like that. It's one of my favorite parts, really, of his game. In terms of movement skills, my favorite part of his game is his hips. The fluidity in his hips is so darn noticeable. And again, when you're playing zone, a lot of times you're flipping your hips, you're changing directions, right? You're dropping the different zone depths. And this is what makes him so difficult and able to, in a Steelers defense, which plays a lot of Tampa 2 coverage, and they slowly kind of became that as a zone team, when you can align from different spots. Okay, this is where versatility is key, right? Whether that's playing the linebacker deep middle role, whether that's dropping into a safety position, or whether that's playing outside underneath in a Tampa 2 look, regardless of what it is, the fluidity in his hips allows him to change directions, but also recover at a really high level. Smooth, you saw the play against Cincinnati where he kind of flips twice and gets back on the ball. This is my favorite trait for him in terms of his body movement is the hips. The hips are so darn fluid. What I said about off-man and how you play off-man, seeing quarterback but also being able to stay in phase, he does show that balance of also reading the quarterback's eyes. You'll get reactions based on a quarterback and where he's looking. You will. So you know that he's aware of where the quarterback is looking. You'll see him undercut routes. There was a play against Cleveland where he literally undercut the route while also understanding, okay, I'm in phase with this guy, but being able to undercut it. And to tie this all together, what's big about this is, again, this comes back to understanding where my help is. And I think he does a nice job of that as well, as understanding certain situations. If I'm bringing a blitz, if we're bringing a blitz, we're bringing 5, I might get a little bit more aggressive. If I have safety help over top, right, we got 2 deep, we're playing 2-man, then okay, I could be a little bit more aggressive to try to undercut this route because I got a safety on top, right? And this is something that, for example, we did against Minnesota with Justin Jefferson. We put a safety over on top. It allowed the corner to kind of play underneath. That's what Jeff did a lot of the time.
Smashed up on the slot receiver. You're going to see Derek Carr watches it. So he ends up sinking down to break on the football, but he's under enough control where he's able to gain his balance and cut this thing off so the ball doesn't come out.
But this is something that I think he does really well, is understand where his help is, and it really all ties together because he's reading eyes, he's got super fluid hips to change direction, and he's an anticipation type of corner with aggressiveness. But for the most part, sometimes he got beat, but for the most part, under controlled aggressiveness because he played through his help, understanding where his help was and understanding what the play was designed to do. So how aggressive can I get? The final transition will be to zone coverage. Okay, talk a little bit of zone coverage. Again, a lot of the skill set is, again, the projection here, right? Because it's not as important, I think, about, okay, what coverage is it? You have to look at the skill set and say, can that translate? And that's what the Lions kind of did with Mike Hughes. They took a look at the skill set, felt it would translate to slot. It didn't. So what they ultimately did is say, okay, it's not great here. He didn't have a big sample size, so we're going to push him to the outside, and he played better there. He played much better. You just had to be matchup aware. There were certain games like, okay, I don't want him on that matchup. We'll put him on this guy. But if we're matchup aware, it's going to work from the outside. I see some similarities there with Cameron Sutton. But when you go to zone coverage, like I said, he lacks some explosiveness downhill, the drive, the plant ability. But one thing that transitions from zone to off man is the ability to break down at the top of a route. I think it's one of his best skill sets because you talk about the fluidity in his hips, but the body control. The guy sinks like a receiver at the top of a route. And this also comes back to route pacing, not getting overly aggressive from the outside, certain matchups. If he's not overly aggressive, it can really help him break down at the top of a route while not being just flying by and the guy sits down because you're trying to just take off and keep up with him. So for him, that's why matchups are important. But he does a fantastic job of sinking at the top of the route without having to beat the drum 100 times to get back, sink, and get back to the ball like a receiver. It was actually extraordinary watching it. It felt weird to watch. It was like, dude, he looks like a receiver in those spots. One of the best traits of his game, I believe, is that ability to sink at the top of the route and get back to the ball. Even though he's not super explosive, he's not the most explosive guy, it's the body control and the anticipation that makes his play speed better from those spots.
And this is little, very subtle, but here from the half turn, you're going to see as that receiver starts to lean, shift his weight. He also starts to shift his weight a little bit over his toes too. You do see that recovery though to flip himself around, but it opens him up for this comeback route on the outside for T. Higgins here.
I just touched on the Tampa too, but just to say it one more time, it's something that the Lions do. While they play a lot of man, when they play zone, one of their favorite zone coverages is a Tampa 2 look. They like the 2 high, they rotate post-snap. So because of that, you're also getting Tampa 2 looks. And one team that we do it a lot against is Green Bay. We've done that recently a lot against is a Green Bay Packers team to keep 2 high deep safeties. To keep 2 deep safeties. And if you remember, look at a guy like Will Harris, you get a lot of different movements, right? Because at that time, Will Harris is playing in the slot for us, but you get a lot of different movements. So for him, the versatility is very clear here. And I think it's back to the hip fluidity because he's very comfortable playing every spot in zone coverage. And also that experience is really going to help him translate anticipation, sniffing out screens. This is something that's also noticeable. Sometimes it's based on alignment. Sometimes it's just a quick trigger and being willing to be aggressive, being light on his toes. But sniffing out screens is a normal occurrence when you watch him play. And this shows. And there was one of my favorite ones was actually Cleveland, the way that he kind of, I wouldn't say he was necessarily the guy that forced the quarterback not to throw it there, but he was part of it. You do see is that awareness, even going back to college, to sniff out, feel screens coming, and then be aggressive to dive and break on them. And we know that's something that the Lions have had their cornerbacks do a really good job of. So he'll fit in perfectly for that. It's cover 3, where I actually legitimately saw improvement. I watched them 2021, and you could see in cover 3, you know, there's beaters to cover 3, of course, where they hit him with like a scissors concept and they end up getting a guy wide open. But then you go to 2022, actually the same team, David Njoku, and they try to hit him with a corner route while also breaking him to the inside. That way that's opened up that part of the field. But you saw the awareness of the weakness of that coverage, the fluidity in his hips to stop, break back down, and get to the ball. Now he attacks the ball differently here. As you notice, he goes low. That's something that he does when he can't necessarily get up to the ball. He's not in a position to get to the ball and attack it. So he'll go low at the catch point, time it up to try to dislodge it that way, or at least limit any yards after the catch from that kind of spot. I really like this is when a play breaks down. Finding receivers, being aware of a receiver is to kind of sit in his way in his zone, but also when a play breaks down, not just sitting in his zone and kind of moving around based on the quarterback's eyes. Instead, finding a receiver in his area, take that away when a play breaks down to really take away where a quarterback can go with the football. Not just floating in a zone, but instead finding someone and taking it out away from the play. Lowest grade came with the play speed that he has, and my highest grade came with the ball skills. It's a lot of it's the anticipation that could set it up, but you do like that he plays through the hands. He's physical at the top of the route, even though occasionally you'll get some grabs and some PIs there, but it's nothing that's like overly a problem. And then on top of that, it's also the recognition based on where he's at, where it's like, hey, at very least, let me go low here, limit yards after the catch, or potentially dislodge it that way. But I think his ball skills are something that he is bringing to the Lions, regardless of what position he plays, that you're always looking to get better at. But for the Lions, it's an area that they definitely wanted to get better at, I think, after this past season.
Some of these receptions that they did get him on, man, they were by a hair. Some of it due to the lack of explosiveness and also maybe length and hand size. But because of the anticipation to undercut the route and the way that he plays through the hands, things are going to get really tight.
Right. More consistency, more production from that type of, from a cornerback position. And I think that's something Cam Sutton brings to a very high level, is his ability to make plays on the football from either inside or outside. Quick little notes on his run defense. Some of these translate, for example, against screens. He's not outstanding at playing blocks, right? He's not a physically imposing defender, and I don't think he has a great way to beat blocks right now. Like Jalen had a really nice way that he knew how to beat blocks, and I don't think he's fantastic at it. For him, it's a lot more trying to set himself up early, going for like a slide by, trip him up, but however, if offensive lineman gets locked up on him, he can really struggle, or really anybody blocking, he could struggle to disengage from that block. He's not the most physically imposing or the strongest corner you're going to find. He's not a Chauncey Gardner-Johnson that's 205 pounds. He's not a Jerry Jacobs, that's just, they got that build, right? And they can really win those battles at the block point. But what he is a guy that plays with anticipation and does a great job of limiting yak. I believe this last season only like 118 yards after the catch. But aside from that, when you really watch the film, he limits yak because I think a lot of it is his tackling form. It's very consistent, it's clean, it's precise. It's low, it's smooth, there's not a lot of action to it, it's quick, and it's done. That's it, right? Now, occasionally you'll get a missed tackle. He had 43 combined tackles to 5 missed tackles this past year, according to Pro Football Reference, which is not bad at all. But it's very clean and precise. It's limit yards after the catch. And he'll even do that again, like I said, if he's in a spot where he doesn't think he can get to the ball, limit yards after catch. And that's one of his best traits, is just limiting any leakage. And especially if you're going to kick in and play nickel reps, that's such an important part, because you're going to give up a lot of receptions, right? I mean, every time someone plays slot, completion percentage goes up because it's just going to. It's much more underneath. It's a lot quicker. There's more field to cover. But if you can limit yards after the catch, that's where it's crucial. And especially on like third downs when you're manned up and a guy tries to run a drag route, right? Not looking back for the fall, but playing through the receiver and limiting that yak. That's what it's about. And that's something that he does an outstanding job of. A player that brings flexibility for zone, he will easily translate to what we do zone-wise, because he can play every spot. The fluidity in his hips and the ball skills give us a different element that we have not had and which we could really use. Plus, we didn't really know who could play nickel for us this past year. We tried with Mike. It didn't really happen, so then we went to Will, and Will's not a natural slot corner, but what Will did well is he communicated well, and that's all the Lions were really looking for. And then he was physical against run. You have to be willing to stick your nose in to play that role. And while this isn't the most physically opposing, as long as he's willing to stick his nose in, you can utilize that in certain games. And for him, one of his best skills, zone coverage, which he played a lot of, is communication. There are never occasions where he's not very clear with teammates. You go here, I'm here. I got this. Pass off this route. There was one play that I saw from 2022 where there was a breakdown. He pointed one guy out, but the route broke differently, so it left his guy open, even though he recognized that he was just late to it. Outside of that, the communication's always very clear. Teammates are very aware. And even if you're wrong, it's just about being on the same page. Too many times Lions will communicate and the other guy doesn't listen, or just nothing happens. Then two guys are covering one. Very clear communication. And I think that's one thing that Mike kind of lacked, was experience of being a communicator, which is so crucial. From his background, right? A guy that played a lot out wide. He didn't really communicate extremely well, but that's something that Sutton will bring, like Will Harris, with a body type that can allow him to be more flexible, much more than what Will Harris was. Even though I really like Will Harris, but it'll allow him to be very flexible. For me, when I look at Cameron Sutton, I view him as a guy that for certain matchups can sit on the outside, can play on the outside for you. You just have to be matchup aware, right? If we're going to continue to play more press man like we do, which is different from what he's coming from, the skill set will allow him to. His quick feet off the line of scrimmage, his anticipation, right? His body control, it will allow him to. You just have to be aware of matchups that you put him in. You have to, because if you just put him against any outside receiver, there are going to be nights that are going to be really tough for him. Also, there's legitimate flexibility to line up
the slot. So I just want to show this quick little rep here of him anticipating this simple but basic crosser.
75% of the time now, 2021, I couldn't even find 2022, but it's risen like every single year. 75% of the time, you're either in a nickel package or a dime package. That's basically a base package now in the NFL. And trust me, this guy will be on the field in some way most of the time. You're going to find a way to put this guy on the field because he's a playmaker. So while some games you may like him on the outside, other games you may want him more on the inside. Matchups are important to that. Go back to what Aaron Glenn told Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. We needed him to improve in coverage because he's going to play some of the best receivers that like to align in the slot, and we need him for that. To me, that's what Cam Sutton brings. He gives you a movable piece, but a different movement piece. It's not important what box we put him in. Oh, he's this. He's listed 1 on the depth chart. That doesn't matter. He's going to be on the field. That's all that matters. So what's important is, where does his skill set work? His skill set is matchup specific on the outside. To me, I think he's going to play a pretty healthy amount in the slot. The point is he's not the guy that's like all matchups you want him on the outside. That's not what he is. There are matchups that will give him problems there. Skill set, I think he easily transitions to a guy that can live in the slot, but also play outside when there's certain matchups that you like more. The flexibility, though, is the most important thing here over everything. I love this signing for the Lions. I think he's got average play speed, but very good ball skills and great body control. This, to me, is an A signing by the Lions, okay? It really is. The next 2 years, he's basically locked in for us, but we wanted a playmaker with flexibility. Lions get a lot of guys with versatility. We have Jeff and Emmanuel Mosley now, who are going to probably live on the outside. I would assume Jerry will, but Jerry could have his opportunity to experiment a little bit inside, and this is a guy that he's going to find a way on the field. Basically, that's what it is. You're not going to not have a role for the guy, because either he'll come in and play the slot against a team that likes to play a lot of 3 wide, Or on the outside, if they're only going to play 2 receivers, which most teams don't, if you have a matchup you like, you'll put him on the outside. There's going to be so much versatility. Would love to be a little bit stronger, a little more physically imposing. That's not his game. He's not a big blitz threat. He was rarely ever asked to blitz. But similarly to Mike Hughes, I think the transition is much more clear here. And what's most important is that he is going to be a playmaker in this secondary, and the Lions need those. Cameron Sutton, I should say, is an A signing for the Detroit Lions, in my opinion. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you, for watching, and I'm out.